Perfect. Wonderful. So again, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Dr. Marshall, and your team for having me. When I moved to a mid-sized city 7 years ago, I was from a big city where I'd spent my whole life. I was shocked by much of the rhetoric that I was hearing about homelessness, both online and with some of the new people I was meeting in my new city. People would refer to our unhoused neighbors as, and I'm quoting here, as junkies, as degenerates, and saying that they don't belong here in this mid-sized city. Over the past 5 years of doing research about misperceptions of homelessness in mid-sized cities, I've come to learn that unfortunately my city is not unique. This visceral and sometimes violent reaction some housed people have to people who are homeless has escalated since the pandemic and the increased visibility of homelessness that has come in the last 5 years. So I'm here to share with you today findings from a research project that myself and my research team have been working on about misperceptions of homelessness and how these misperceptions are tied to what is known as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Before I go any further, I want to touch base about the language that I am using here. So when we began this project, we firmly rooted our understanding of the situation in NIMBY. It's actually the title of the project. That's how much we sort of understood this work to be about NIMBYism. So NIMBYism describes the relational and political pushback from citizen groups to how land is used in a variety of contexts, but especially any form of social housing or homeless support organization to exist in their neighborhood. NIMBYism is also connected or related to anti-development terms, and there's a bunch of terms out there. So sobby is some other bugger's backyard, which describes people who have support for the development as long as it's not in their neighborhood. Banana, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. Nope, not on planet Earth. Note, not over there either. And cave, citizens against virtually everything. All of these different terms describe, for the most part, a complete rejection of any kind of supports or housing for low-income people. And indeed, these terms do describe some people, and in my city, some politicians who are completely against any kind of building, any kind of resourcing or support for housing and homelessness responses. But as we carried out this research and we heard from more people with a range of perspectives on the issue, and we witnessed how the term NIMBY is often used, we began to see that it didn't capture most people who we're talking to. Most of whom did indeed support the idea of services and supports for unhoused people, but expressed concerns. Sometimes I would say quite legitimate, others rooted in fear, more fear than fact. We also came to see how quickly people put up their defenses when the term NIMBY was thrown their way. So in our experience, it almost always shuts down conversation and limits our ability to effectively move the collective conversation forward towards evidence-based human rights responses to homelessness. So because of this, we refrain from using the term NIMBY unless it is an obviously applicable term. We haven't found a good alternate term to capture the nuance we've come to understand, but some acronyms floating around, because I know you want more acronyms, are NIMI, which is not in my election year, which gets at politicians who just don't want to deal with it during their term, or NIBI, not in everyone's backyard. This signals that some neighborhoods are shouldering an unequal burden of these kinds of supports. And these are usually areas that are already more impoverished themselves, whereas other more wealthy and politically connected neighborhoods have none of those services. So that's just some things to think about as we move through the discussion today. I want to give you a sense of where I'm hoping the conversation gets picked up today. I want to talk about mid-sized cities, and I'm so glad, thank you, Dr. Marshall, for having folks introduce themselves at the beginning. I saw a lot of people from London, Kingston, a lot of mid-sized cities here. So I think hopefully this conversation is especially relevant for you. So much of what we hear about in research, on the news, through social media, are about the large urban centers. It's about Toronto, it's about Vancouver, it's about Montreal. I want to take this time to think about what it's like for smaller communities, the challenges and the opportunities mid-sized cities face. Second, whether coming from hatred, fear, or a misunderstanding of the issues, the anti-homeless rhetoric is pervasive in many mid-sized cities, and that ends up being reflected in the bylaws, funding arrangements, and on-the-ground responses to homelessness put forward by municipal officials who in some cases run on a platform of using punitive approaches to respond to homelessness. And third, I want to spend the bulk of our time together sharing with you the findings that we have from our research about how not only are punitive approaches to homelessness ineffective, but we argue actually make the problem of homelessness and its visibility worse. So hopefully I can convince you of that today. I'm here representing a team of 13 researchers spanning 4 universities and different backgrounds. So I'm just one person, there's a whole group behind me here. Our research team includes 3 lived expert researchers representing the 3 cities where we conducted the research. They have been instrumental in the success of the project and have led their own sort of side projects as part of this bigger project, which I would love, it's at the end of my slides. If we have time, I'd love to chat about in the discussion afterwards, if there's time. I also want to recognize that we were supported in this work by the 3 municipalities as partners on this project. The research took place on the lands where I'm on, of the Chinantan, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people as part of the Haldimand Tract, and in another city on the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also want to thank SSHRC for funding this project through a partnership development grant. So the goal of the research that we've been doing for the past 5 years has been about understanding the perceptions and misperceptions about homelessness in mid-sized cities. Our ultimate aim is to help build community resiliency in how we respond to homelessness. So our project is a case study of 3 mid-sized cities in Southern Ontario, each with a population of between 100 and 150,000 people. We carried out our project in 3 phases. First, we conducted a media analysis of looking at local news outlets and social media posts. And we also conducted an environmental scan of how these cities policies are responding to homelessness. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the findings from phase 2, which were interviews we conducted with a variety of community actors. And third, as Dr. Marshall already foreshadowed so nicely, we also engaged in something called a broker dialogue methodology to facilitate a conversation about a controversial issue in a way that is safe for all participants, because the researchers broker the dialogue. Where we're looking to draw out points of shared understanding and vision on how to move forward. So the promised QR code, I hope it can get there. Maybe it's too zoomed in. Hopefully it does. If not, if you Google Bridging Divides, it'll come up as well. So this broker dialogue culminated in the creation of the documentary Dr. Marshall mentioned, Bridging Divides. We are very proud of this documentary. It's hard to make a documentary, so I hope everybody sees it. And we've been touring the documentary around as much as possible, doing screenings with anyone and everyone, with usually a panel discussion afterwards that Dr. Marshall has taken part in some of those as well. So we've done these in small community groups. We've done it with the federal government department. So it's free on YouTube if you'd like to check it out. That's my plug. So for today's conversation, though, I want to focus on the data from the interviews we did in these 3 cities. We interviewed 4 key actor groups across the 3 cities: people experiencing homelessness, service providers, community members, which range from business owners to community associations to concerned community groups, and law enforcement, which included police, bylaw, and first responders. So we interviewed a number of fire fire personnel. We made sure that we heard most from lived experts so that their voices grounded the data collection and analysis. We focused this project, as I've mentioned, on mid-sized cities because we have recognized the unique conditions they face in their response to homelessness. Yet, we know relatively little about how this functions. So most of the research on homelessness comes from those major urban centers I already mentioned. In the last few years, we've seen important research devoted to rural and remote homelessness in communities that have very few, if any, resources dedicated specifically to addressing homelessness, and where homelessness is most often hidden. So Dr. Marshall's ongoing work will be an important contribution to that area, to building up that work on rural homelessness. But mid-sized cities don't fit neatly into that urban or the rural category. So they reside somewhere in the middle. Mid-sized cities are experiencing more visible homelessness than ever, and many communities are struggling to come to terms with this new reality. I want to be crystal clear. These mid-sized cities are seeing visible homelessness for the first time. Hidden homelessness, whether it's sleeping in cars, couch surfing, living in a motel until their savings run out, staying in an unsafe household, are all forms of homelessness that have existed in mid-sized cities and all size cities for as long as we've had cities. The reason that we in this project were especially focused on visible homelessness is because this is where the disconnect between people who are homeless and these quote unquote concerned citizens, or where these perceptions are coming from. There is public upset about visible encampments, about people in distress on the sidewalk, about safe consumption sites, but there is virtually no uproar about hidden homelessness. Women and gender diverse people staying in unsafe relationships, or youth kicked out of the house and sleeping on a friend's couch, for instance, despite how prevalent and crucial these situations are. So we focused on where that public ire is coming from, and that's visible homelessness. We recognize that mid-sized cities face unique challenges in their orientation to homelessness. One of these challenges is that mid-sized cities don't have the same resources, supports, and capacity as large urban centers. So for example, in Toronto, there are shelters dedicated to women, shelters dedicated to youth, wonderfully, a shelter dedicated to 2S LGBTQAI+ youth, shelters for Indigenous folks, and so on. Whereas in one of the case study cities that we looked at, there is only one shelter for the entire city. So fewer supports means that it's harder to meet different people's needs, which then increases the risk that systems will fail people who need them, especially equity-deserving groups. And this will cause or perpetuate homelessness. It's also hard in a mid-sized cities to be one of the few support organizations on the scene. If there is one shelter or one drop-in or one community hub, it is hard to be that one resource in the city. I've witnessed firsthand the anger that gets directed towards a provider when they are the only service available in the city. So rather than in bigger cities, other support services sharing the burden of public outcry, lone organizations tend to be blamed for bringing homelessness to the city rather than those services actually responding to a pre-existing need. As municipalities are largely tasked with managing homelessness, and we can have a conversation about that and how detrimental that is, but knowing that municipalities are facing the burden of this response, knowing what works and what doesn't work locally is really important. So mid-sized cities, though, rarely have a long history of responding to homelessness because, again, this visible homelessness is relatively new. So there isn't this institutional memory in many of these mid-sized cities to lean on like the big cities have, so that they can avoid common pitfalls or move on successful strategies quickly. So just as an example, in my mid-sized city, up until I would say last year, I'm looking, it's a snow day today. My backyard is covered in snow. Up until last year, there was no winter readiness program. So knowing what out of the cold programs to open. And so every year it would be like December 1st before they go, we need to do this. Now that it's been a few years of having visible homelessness, in the last 2 years, they start prepping in July for what will be winter warming. So it's that kind of just knowing what needs to be done that a few years ago, my mid-sized city didn't have, and now they do. This lack of just institutional knowledge and capacity extends outside of the municipal government. Mid-sized cities tend to have less organized advocacy in the community. As grassroots advocates on the ground in these communities have told me, mid-sized cities don't have the same number of allies and supporters as large cities. So this means that the advocates that are there in these mid-sized cities are prone to burnout because there is such a small team of people who have to take on every time that there's something that needs to be advocated for. I want to take a moment to reflect on one of the most dominant narratives we heard in this project and a predecessor project we did to this in British Columbia. And that's the research we published on. And it's the idea that unhoused people are not, quote unquote, from here. So much of the narrative from concerned community members comes from this lamenting of how things used to be, this hearkening back to a time supposedly when homelessness, but actually visible homelessness, didn't exist in their small community. This was true. We heard this same kind of rhetoric also from people who are homeless themselves, who spoke about new faces and not knowing everyone who was homeless in their community. There is no doubt that homelessness is growing. But data tells us that the people who are homeless are largely from here. According to point-in-time count data from mid-sized cities across Canada, 65% of people who are homeless have lived in the community for more than 5 years, and 30% of people have been born and raised in that same community. Despite this data, some community members use this idea that they belong to a community where everyone is supposed to know everyone else's name and take care of each other, to claim that homelessness can't and shouldn't exist in their community. They are imagining a community that really never existed, but even if it had, it doesn't exist in this time and this space and under these political and economic regimes. But holding on to that idea of what their small town is supposed to be acts as a narrative block from acknowledging that homelessness is here and that it must be meaningfully addressed. Not only does the narrative make it difficult to think about long-term solutions, but this drive to get their small city back leaves many people calling for a heavy punitive response to homelessness, to eradicate visible homelessness from the city, especially downtown areas, when in fact, policing homelessness only increases homelessness overall. And so I want to spend the rest of my time with you today digging into the impact of using these punitive approaches to respond to homelessness and walk you through what we've called the invisibility trap. Many of the policies and initiatives that mid-sized cities are using to respond to homelessness have the underlying goal of invisibilizing or hiding, not solving homelessness. However, we argue that many of these activities paradoxically make the solution or the situation, more visible to the public. So in their efforts to hide, it's actually increasing visibility of homelessness. Not only that, but it further entrenches homelessness and increases distress and poor health and well-being for people who are unhoused. So we've outlined this trap in a visual report that, again, I have a QR code here that you can access the very short, I believe it's 8 pages, visual report. So this is a sort of map of a mid-sized city that shows the 5 paradoxes we've identified. And the more fulsome report gets at alternate evidence-informed, human rights-focused approaches to get out of that trap. So I'm going to take us on this map. I'm going to take us through this map. and guide us through each of the 5 paradoxes, starting with toxic media. The first paradox we really draw from our media analysis for this paradox, where we identified how traditional media, but especially social media, is used by some housed community members to call for the city to remove unhoused people from the city outright, right? A lot of what we hear is just get them out of there, with no kind of understanding of what that even means or what that would look like. We found particular Facebook groups in each city that acted as a magnet for people to write out their most heinous, sometimes violent, and often inaccurate opinions about homelessness. The paradox we found here is that many of these posts were written with the goal of, again, removing homelessness altogether from a neighborhood, but it actually centered homelessness in conversations where it didn't belong, making it seem more pervasive and problematic than it is. So, for example, there would be Facebook posts about, oh, look at all this littering. So people would take it. That's why that image is there. It comes from a real scenario in one of these Facebook groups. There'd be litter on the ground, and it would take like 5 or 6 comments before it turned into, it must be unhoused people who are doing this. We need to get rid of them. So a post that wasn't about homelessness regularly in these Facebook groups devolved into ire about homelessness. So, for example, so much of the discourse about homelessness in the downtown core uses this idea that visible homelessness is negatively impacting tourism in their cities. By writing op-eds and writing Reddit posts about how homelessness is quote unquote ruining the downtown, they are in fact adding to that narrative. So then prospective tourists will see these posts and decide not to travel there, not because of homelessness, but because of the narrative that has been created about homelessness. Also, the piling on of hate-filled language and opinions about homelessness fuels anger and contempt about homelessness, making it harder to implement progressive, evidence-based solutions that would actually address the issue of visible homelessness. Next on our little map, we're going to be going to the next paradox, nowhere to go. For any municipality or not-for-profit organization who's tried to build housing or tried to build spaces for people who've experienced homelessness, I'm sure many people in this virtual room, they can tell you about the pushback they've received from neighbors, sometimes making it impossible to continue with much needed projects because there's literally nowhere to put them. This is the essence of NIMBYism. This is where NIMBYism may or may not be a relevant term. The concern is often that these services will attract or keep people who are homeless in the area. But this resistance means there simply aren't enough places where unhoused people are permitted or welcomed to be. And when people have nowhere to go, they are still humans who occupy a human body who have to exist in space somewhere. They naturally become more visible across the community, especially in the downtown core. So an example that, again, I imagine rings true to many people in this room is that a not-for-profit, tries to buy a piece of land to build supportive housing as part of their response to the housing crisis. The neighbors fight the development and win. Probably a rezoning issue is usually where that is able to happen, because they raise worries about traffic, safety, and I'm quoting here, neighborhood character, which is a personal frustration of mine as a reason to not build supports. The people who would have lived in that supportive housing building with wraparound supports instead remain in the local shelter or the encampment, which forces them to leave every day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. if they're staying in the shelter. With no other options, they spend their days walking through downtown, ducking into coffee shops or restaurants or stores just to stay warm or to stay cool, and ultimately making homelessness more visible than if they had supported the solution and built the supportive housing. Next on our little map, We are moving on to a paradox that's deeply related to that nowhere to go, which is moving people along. As more people experiencing homelessness become visible in public spaces, it sets off a cycle of complaints. This is actually the subject of another article that we're hoping to be published soon. It's written, we just have to submit it. Community members call police or call bylaw whenever they see someone who's unhoused, expecting that the response will be that the person has to move. But with nowhere to go, people simply relocate to another part of town where new neighbors see them, file more complaints, and the whole thing repeats. Law enforcement that we talked to, multiple law enforcement from the three cities, used the phrase whack-a-mole to describe what they feel like their job is and what they're doing. And all of this constant displacement makes it much harder for unhoused people to stay connected to services so that, outreach can find them, hang on to important items like their ID or medication, and ultimately makes it more difficult to move out of homelessness. Research from Chris Herring out of the US showed that 91% of people who received a move along order continued to live outside. Not a surprise, because almost always when people are told to move along, they're not offered housing. And 64% moved only a few blocks over or returned to that same spot that they'd been moved along after a couple of days. So when we refer to the visibility simply of moving people to another spot, we're not talking about a whole new neighborhood, which is, I think, what a lot of those concerned complainants are trying to get at. Most often, the move is simply down the road and often will come back. Next on our map is moving to overregulation and control. We also see a pattern where community complaints about things that aren't criminal, like a tent being beside a trail, someone spending time in a park, or walking through a neighborhood, trigger a law enforcement response. In a separate but related project, led by one of my amazing MA students, we heard from a bylaw officer who described how he is busiest in the autumn because falling leaves mean that blue tarps that were already there are now visible, prompting complaint calls from neighbors. So it's not that they were experiencing trouble or anything from the unhoused person, but now that they see that very clear symbol of homelessness, that symbol of a blue tarp, now they're filing a complaint. Whether it's police, bylaw, or private security, when uniformed officers and cruisers show up for something that isn't a crime, it creates the impression in the narrative in the community that people who are homeless are doing something criminal, even when nothing illegal is happening. I saw this myself firsthand last month when I went to witness an encampment eviction in my mid-sized city. By the time the eviction took place, they had given several notices. So by the time the eviction took place, only 3 people remained at this encampment. All 3 of them were women in their 50s and 60s who faced significant physical health challenges. And that's why they hadn't moved when everybody else had. I personally counted, I was there for 5 hours. I personally counted and documented 3 police cruisers, all at once, 3 police cruisers, 1 bylaw officer, and a 5-person crew from a hazmat company, and at least 3 police cruisers. They were on 2 sides of the trail, so I wasn't able to count them all at once, but I believe 3 police cruisers, all there to displace these 3 women who very truly, I mean this because we tried everything, very truly had nowhere to go because our 1 temporary women's shelter in my city was completely full. The encampment was located, if I was going to choose a place for an encampment, it was, I think, an ideal location. So the encampment was located in a large park, but it was in a segment between a wall and a forested area and not part of a trail. I had driven by this area many times and I had never noticed the tents before. I actually didn't know there was an encampment there until I was asked to come bear witness. But now, all those cruisers and all that law enforcement officers that were there, for anybody who drove down these 2 roads that day, they would have now known that unhoused people are there and likely assumed nefarious activity was going on, even though there was no evidence of such. And our final stop on our map, the dog was my daughter's favorite part of this whole map, the little doggy there, is that this last paradox came largely from our interviews with our unhoused neighbors. And this gets at exclusion and social isolation. So all of these dynamics that I've been pointing to, moving people along, blocking or under-resourcing supports and spaces for people who are homeless, end up having the opposite effect. People experiencing homelessness feel even more visible, more isolated, and more stigmatized by these actions. The distress they carry and the loss of dignity they often face in everyday interactions can deepen their sense of hopelessness and make it even harder to see a path out of homelessness. Dr. Marshall, actually, I'm just thinking Dr. Marshall's work on transitioning out of homelessness is really key to this piece and what hopelessness does to folks when they're trying to successfully exit homelessness. When communities fight against building or funding programs that can provide people with a sense of dignity, things like sanitation and shower facilities, places to do their laundry, places to put people's belongings so they don't have everything they own on their person at one time. Without those, they become easier to identify and more visible as homeless. So my academics here, people who may have been able to pass, and I'm using Goffman's sense of the term of it passing, kind of not people noticing that they're homeless, now have to carry these symbols of homelessness with them when they otherwise could have been seen as neighbors who are just moving around the downtown core, just as any housed person does. So each one of these paradoxes were evident in the mid-sized cities that we studied, and I've heard similar stories in other mid-sized communities across Canada. It can paint a picture that these mid-sized cities have the odds stacked against them. And while there certainly are challenges, I want to end here with the opportunities that are available in mid-sized cities. Some very cool people doing amazing work in Kelowna inspired much of my thinking about this, so I want to give credit to the Kelowna folks. That small town feel that I spoke about earlier, and that so many of those narratives are clinging to, rather than being an obstacle, can be a way to build the community. If people pride themselves on, we look out for each other, we take care of one another in this community, we can think about messaging that includes our unhoused neighbors and who they take care of. Similarly, while mid-sized cities may not have the same number of services as urban centers, it can be beneficial in terms of coordination and working together. Often in mid-sized cities, workers will know each other and can call each other up informally to strategize on supports available to help somebody in need. They're also more likely to know their unhoused neighbors by name and then tailor those responses to them. While there may be, and there are, what we call serial complainers in some mid-sized communities, there are also champions that many people will know of and respect. The benefit of being a local hero, so we're thinking like the radio personalities or the former mayors or city councilors and things like that, that local hero has a really wide reach. Many people know their names and appreciate what they have to say. This can be an enormous opportunity to leverage local fandom to support initiatives and meaningfully address homelessness. And finally, specific locally tailored supports can address different concerned community members in a way that works for them. So whether it's business owners or neighbors or municipal staff, we can have one-on-one conversations and hear their concerns and think about how do we address their concern in a meaningful way while not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Let's address whatever the fear or concern is without having to say, well, let's just get rid of homelessness in our city. So having these concerns addressed can be advantageous to addressing those concerns and their needs while supporting long-term solutions to homelessness. There's much more I wanted to share with you. It was hard to keep it at the time, especially around the learnings and how we're using this actually to build high school curriculum. So would love to talk about that if there's time in the conversation, but I will leave it there because I'd love to hear from you all about this. I'm sure you all have lots of stories and things to share. So I will stop sharing my screen.